the 90s, without a doubt, the best decade for rock? Simple answer. The 90s were the moment when all the great genres and all the great bands in the history of rock converged. The 90s weren't just the era of grunge or nu metal. They were also the decade when metal finally broke into the mainstream and, at the same time, the last chance to see the classic giants in all their splendor. The early 90s were undeniably the time of grunge. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains burst in with a force that reshaped the entire rock landscape. These bands were the last true flash of freshness and originality of rock as a movement. Sure, original bands have appeared since then, but grunge was the last time that a whole wave of bands created a new musical and cultural code, sharing an attitude and a worldview even though their sounds were different. But the 90s were also the moment when great metal bands finally reached the wider public. In the 80s, they had already made amazing albums, but they still hadn't crossed over. Metallica is the best example. The Black Album put metal right on the front row of record store shelves across the world. And alongside them, Megadeth, Slayer, Pantera, Sepultura, and others shone throughout the decade. So especially in the early years, metal and grunge were everywhere. The 90s were also dominated by one of the greatest hard rock bands of all time. A band that was already huge in the 80s but became absolutely gigantic in the 90s. Guns N' Roses. They left their mark on the first years of the decade with a double album that sold millions and a monumental tour that lasted more than 2 years and took them through a little over 27 countries. So at the very beginning of the 90s, there was a mythical moment when grunge from Nirvana, the metal of Metallica, and the hard rock of Guns N' Roses were all sounding at the same time. In fact, those last two even went out on tour together on a joint bill. And it wasn't just the colossi of the 80s filling the airwaves in the 90s. The living legends of the 70s were there too. Barely into the decade, AC/DC showed with Thunderstruck that in their third decade of existence, they could still write a brand new rock classic. Around the same time, Judas Priest released what might well be their finest record and maybe the best heavy metal album ever. In the middle of the decade, Pink Floyd put out their final studio album, majestic like everything the Floyd have done. And even the 70s bands that weren't releasing new albums still made their presence felt in the 90s. The best example is Black Sabbath. The original lineup hadn't played together in more than 10 years, and still their legacy was everywhere. Proof of that is the tribute Nativity in Black, where rising metal bands reignited Sabbath's crushing riffs and power. Another 70s legend, Led Zeppelin, was also honored with a tribute album recorded by 90s bands. And the most famous half of Zeppelin, the Page Plant duo, got back on stage together and brought back some of that Zeppelin magic from the 70s. Even the greatest band of the 60s had a presence in the 90s. The Beatles, despite the physical absence of John Lennon, released 2 new songs built around his voice and rekindled Beatlemania yet again, proving they had never really left. And on top of all that, there were the bands that didn't belong to any particular movement but stood out for their sheer individuality. Rage Against the Machine, Helmet, Tool, Faith No More, Primus, 9 Inch Nails, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Radiohead, the Smashing Pumpkins. All of them flooded the soundscape of the decade with quality. Each one in its own way pushed the genre forward. They remind us that one of the defining traits of the 90s was diversity. Later in the second half of the decade, nu metal appeared, which, beyond any criticism, meant that rock once again grabbed the attention of labels, radio stations, and teenagers looking for music in tune with the anger that comes with that age. And as the 90s were coming to an end, we witnessed one of the most original phenomena in the history of rock, electronic rock. Because that's what the Chemical Brothers, Fatboy Slim, and the Prodigy were really. People who traded guitars, bass, and drums for synths, drum machines, and sequencers to create sounds that were part punk, part funk, and even a bit metal. So I'm not claiming that the best rock bands of all time were born in that decade. What I'm saying is that in the 90s, all the great bands and all the great genres were sounding at the same time. And that gave us the last decade in which rock was truly mainstream. On the radio, on TV, overflowing the record stores, packing arenas. That's why the 90s were, without a doubt, the best era for rock.